the United States has just released its new national security strategy. And this time, Washington finally says the quiet part out loud. America is not here to save the world. America is here to make sure it remains the strongest, the wealthiest, and the most dominant power on the planet for decades to come. So what is this strategy really protecting? Is it defending democracy? Or is it defending the dollar, the supply chain, and America's own sphere of influence? And Taiwan, where does it fit in? In this strategy, is Taiwan a partner? Or a strategic asset, a location so critical, a function so irreplaceable, that it simply cannot be allowed to fail? Today, we're breaking down 3 things. First, what America's ideal world actually looks like. Second, the tools Washington intends to use to shape that world. And third, what this new strategy means for Taiwan, the Indo-Pacific, and Europe in the years ahead. Here is the English narration, rewritten for Western audiences, with a clean documentary-style tone, natural flow, and a Taiwan as case study, framing preserved. This is ready for voiceover, no labels, no explanations, just the script. When you read this new national security strategy, one thing becomes obvious. It's not really describing the world. It's describing what America wants to become. The White House lays out a wish list that isn't shy at all. The world's strongest military, the strongest nuclear deterrent, the strongest economy, the strongest industrial base, the strongest energy dominance, the strongest technology leadership. And yes, even the strongest cultural influence. But here's where it gets interesting. Washington has now pulled issues that used to be domestic and upgraded them into matters of national security. The strategy talks about restoring spiritual and cultural health, strengthening traditional families, and rejecting DEI and so-called radical ideologies. Which really says one thing. If a national security strategy starts talking about mental health and family structure, then the biggest threats, in their view, aren't abroad. They're at home. And then come the guiding principles. A list that reads almost like an American textbook on political realism. Each line quietly overturns the old post-Cold War order. America first. Policy isn't ideology. If it benefits the United States, do it. Peace through strength. Peace comes from overwhelming power, military, technological, economic, cultural, layered together. Flexible realism. No more moral lectures. No more trying to fix other countries. If cooperation serves U.S. interests, democracy is optional. Primacy of nations. The world isn't ruled by ideals or institutions. It's ruled by nation-states, each with the right to put its own interests first. And yes, that also conveniently justifies America doing exactly the same. Skepticism toward international organizations. If a global institution erodes national sovereignty, reform it, or sideline it. Sovereignty and respect. Protecting U.S. borders, society, and political discourse from foreign influence is now a core security priority. Pro-American worker. Foreign policy must serve American labor. No more tolerating trade deficits or allies freeloading on U.S. generosity. Put together, these principles say one thing. America hasn't changed. It has simply stopped pretending. Then we get to the priorities: border security, immigration, burden sharing, and economic power. First, borders and immigration. The document is more blunt than most campaign speeches. The era of mass migration must end. Border security is a first-order element of national security. Immigration, crime, cartels, trafficking, terrorism. Everything is reframed as a security threat. Domestic anxieties have officially become national strategy. Next, burden sharing, though a more accurate term might be burden shifting. The strategy even uses the myth of Atlas to make its point. The era of America carrying the world on its shoulders is over. What does Washington want? NATO spending at 5% of GDP. Regional powers taking responsibility for their own security. And the U.S. acting not as a parent, but as a convener and amplifier. In simpler terms, you carry your weight first. Then we'll help. And finally, economic security. Which, in this strategy, reads less like policy and more like a blueprint for rebuilding American dominance. Balanced trade. Control of critical supply chains and raw materials. Full-scale reindustrialization and a revived defense base. Energy supremacy and financial supremacy, especially the dollar. You can summarize the whole section in one sentence. This isn't a national security document. It's a plan to rebuild America's industrial, energy, and financial hegemony. In the chapter on the Western Hemisphere, the strategy doesn't even try to be subtle. It's titled, The Trump Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And the message is unmistakable. The United States intends to reassert full dominance over the Western Hemisphere. It wants to block any outside power from deploying forces or controlling critical assets in the region. And it plans to use military presence, diplomatic pressure, and financial tools to pull Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean back into Washington's strategic orbit. In simple terms, Monroe Doctrine 2.0 is online. But this time, it's not just about military influence. It's about supply chains and critical minerals too. Then we move to Asia and China, a section written almost like a KPI dashboard. Win the economic future, prevent military confrontation. America's China strategy operates on 3 layers. First, redefining the relationship itself. The strategy openly admits that the old bet, that bringing China into the global rules-based order would tame it, has failed. So the new plan is rebalance trade, reduce supply chain dependence, restrict sensitive technologies. Second, compete for the global south. Washington points out that China has already built supply chain and infrastructure networks across low-income countries. So the U.S. now intends to counter that by coordinating with Japan, South Korea, Europe, and India to win back those markets. And third, turn technology and finance into long-term strategic weapons. AI, quantum, space, undersea capabilities, nuclear systems. They're all designated as domains of competition. In short, avoid a shooting war. Win the economic and technological war instead. This brings us to Taiwan and the first island chain. Not as a political argument, but as a strategic case study. The strategy states it plainly. The world pays attention to Taiwan not just because of democracy, and not only because of semiconductors, but because Taiwan's geography splits Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia into 2 separate theaters, and anchors access to the second island chain. It also notes that 1/3 of global shipping moves through the South China Sea. A Taiwan conflict would strike directly at America's economic core. So U.S. policy boils down to 3 lines. Deterring conflict in the Taiwan Strait is a top priority. Maintain the long-standing policy of not supporting unilateral changes to the status quo. And build a U.S. force posture across the entire first island chain that can deny aggression. Washington expects partners, Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines, to raise defense spending, open more bases and ports, and invest in forces specifically designed for deterrence. The simplest way to describe the role Taiwan plays in this strategy is this: a semiconductor hub, a geographic choke point, and a maritime gateway. 3 strategic assets in one location. And then there is Europe. The chapter is titled, Promoting European Greatness. But the content is anything but flattering. It's the longest critique in the entire document. The strategy lists Europe's challenges one by one. A shrinking share of global GDP. Sovereignty diluted by supranational institutions and bureaucracy. Mass migration pressures. Speech restrictions. Collapsing birth rates and a loss of civilizational confidence. Even a warning about the risk of civilizational erasure. On the war in Ukraine, the U.S. goal is to secure a ceasefire, restore stability, and prevent the conflict from spilling over, while criticizing European leaders for being unrealistic. And the conclusion is blunt. Europe needs to grow up. America will encourage it, pressure it. If I had to summarize this national security strategy in one sentence, it would be this. It's not a plan to save the world. It's a manual for redistributing the world. The entire document sends one consistent message. America is done pretending to be the world's moral teacher. It now wants to be the majority shareholder of the international system. And every chapter quietly answers the same set of questions. Who gets invited into America's new order? Who gets left outside? Who becomes a tool? And who becomes a burden? First, America has turned its own culture war into a national security issue. The strategy talks about restoring spiritual and cultural health, strengthening traditional families, and rejecting DEI and so-called radical ideologies. Phrases that normally belong in textbooks or campaign speeches. Now elevated into security doctrine. And what does that tell us? It tells us the U.S. knows its biggest threat isn't always China or Russia. Sometimes, the real danger comes from within. The more you read, the clearer it gets. This NSS isn't designed to protect America from foreign enemies. It's designed to treat America's internal fractures. Second, Taiwan is not described in terms of values, only functions. There's no talk of shared democracy or common ideals. What Washington highlights instead are semiconductors, maritime choke points, and strategic geography in the first island chain. Put together, they lead to a blunt but honest conclusion. Taiwan is an asset, not a narrative. A function, not a philosophy. And that's not an insult. It's the strategic reality. Because assets, especially irreplaceable ones, must never break, never fall, and never slip into someone else's hands. Third, U.S. allies, especially Europe, are no longer treated as a community of democracies. They're treated like high-cost clients. The strategy criticizes Europe for declining birth rates and cultural erosion, being constrained by supranational institutions, insufficient defense spending, and a lack of strategic confidence. This isn't how you talk to a partner. This is how a CEO talks to an underperforming division. And the conclusion is straightforward. Pay more. Handle your own problems. Stop depending on us. America isn't abandoning Europe. It simply wants Europe to stop being a democratic child the U.S. has to raise, and start being a self-funded, competent collaborator. Across the document, one attitude stands out. Allies aren't value groups. They're cost centers. And fourth, here's the most conspiratorial interpretation. This NSS reads like a ranking system for the post-globalization world. If you peel back the language, a very clear hierarchy emerges. America is grading countries by their strategic usefulness. Tier 1. Nations that must never fail, never drift, and must remain tightly inside the U.S. system. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the UK, Australia. Tier 2. Countries that are useful, but replaceable. India, parts of Southeast Asia, parts of Europe. Tier 3. Countries that can be watched from a distance. The Global South, much of the Middle East, and nations without strategic industries or locations. The NSS never states this openly. But its language on reindustrialization, supply chain realignment, energy control, and financial dominance all point toward the same objective. Deciding early who gets on the boat, who stays on the shore, and who gets left outside the harbor altogether. Read this document as a global instruction manual. And you'll see it clearly. America is already writing the rules for the next phase of globalization. And this time, not everyone gets to play. This time, America chooses the team. Prediction 2. The U.S. and China won't fight a full war over Taiwan. But they will enter a 10 to 20-year era of high-tension standoff. The strategy repeats phrases like deterring aggression, denying adversary advantages, shaping the rhythm of the island chain. That isn't the language of war. It's the language of managed confrontation. In the coming decade, expect to see frequent but controlled encounters between ships and aircraft. Rising friction, but kept below the threshold of escalation. A denser and more varied U.S. presence across the first island chain. Routine cycles of probing, surveillance, counter-surveillance. Becoming part of daily regional life. What Washington really wants is this. Never start a war. Never allow the other side to win. It's the cheapest, most stable strategy available. And it leads to one outcome. The Taiwan Strait will become a high-tension, low-eruption zone for the next 10 to 20 years. Never exploding, always smoldering. Prediction 3. Europe will experience a soft decoupling from the U.S. And Washington may actually welcome it. The strategy speaks to Europe in a tone that sounds more like a reprimand than diplomacy. Civilizational erosion. Sovereignty hollowed out by bureaucracy. Inadequate defense spending. Collapsing birth rates. It sounds harsh, but it signals something deeper. The U.S. no longer wants to carry Europe's security costs. So expect a surge in European defense spending, already underway in France and Germany. A shift towards semi-autonomous European defense. And Washington quietly supporting it. Because it frees U.S. resources for the Indo-Pacific. The likely end state? Europe becomes a strategic outsourcing zone, not abandoned, but no longer the priority. Prediction 4. The world is moving towards supply chain blocks, and the U.S. intends to lead the biggest one. The strategy repeats 3 ideas: reindustrialization, energy independence, control of critical supply chains. In global terms, this means one thing. Globalization isn't disappearing. It's breaking into competing economic blocks. And America's goal is simple. Keep the most profitable, most advanced, most irreplaceable parts of the global supply chain permanently inside the U.S. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are being locked in not because of shared ideals, but because they're too valuable, too capable, and too strategically placed. The darker interpretation? The future won't be democracy versus authoritarianism. It will be supply chain versus supply chain. Prediction 5. America's real battleground over the next decade will be financial dominance. Every chapter of the strategy hints at the same thing. The global settlement system, capital flows, sanctions leverage, and the fusion of technology with finance. The message is clear. The U.S. military isn't in crisis. The dollar is. So expect more aggressive and faster sanctions. A modernized, more controlled dollar-based settlement system. Tighter regulation of cross-border payments and crypto. And potentially, a new kind of a dollar standard, a redesigned financial architecture to bind the world to the U.S. Again. The document never says it outright. But the tone leaves no ambiguity. Defending the dollar is defending America. Prediction 6. The U.S. is shifting from leading the world to choosing teams. The strategy states it directly. The goal isn't to make everyone follow America, but to ensure America stands with the most important countries. This creates a 3-tier world. Tier 1. 4 strategic states, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, the UK. Countries too important in tech, military posture, or supply chains to lose. Tier 2. Situational partners, India, parts of Southeast Asia, parts of Europe. Useful, but not always reliable. Tier 3. Countries Washington doesn't need to court and doesn't intend to confront. Much of the global south, much of the Middle East. This isn't a Cold War binary. It's a multi-layered competition centered on U.S. interests. Low cost for America. High flexibility. And for After reading America's new national security strategy, you realize something unsettling. The world isn't falling apart. It's being deliberately rearranged. Washington has made one thing unmistakably clear. It will defend values, only when those values serve its interests. It will stand by allies, only when those allies deliver strategic benefits. That's not cruelty. That's the new international reality. So here's the question. In this newly reordered world, where does Taiwan stand? In the first tier? The second? Or is it being pushed into becoming a critical asset that everyone wants to control? But here's the darkest part. If the United States keeps drowning in cultural wars, political paralysis, and endless bargaining with its own allies, if it refuses to repair the real fractures in its national strength, then over the next decade, the global balance may quietly tilt toward China. Not because China is rising that fast, but because America, slowly and steadily, is. If you found this analysis valuable, consider subscribing and liking the video. It helps this channel bring you sharper, clearer insights into a world that's shifting faster than ever.